Great. Well, thanks for having me today, everyone, and thanks, Thomas, for that lovely introduction. So, Evaluation 101, how to do it practically and purposefully. And I want to say, first of all, I was really excited at the keynote yesterday from Sharon that she said, and one of her first points was, animals need us to be effective. So today we're going to talk about how we can actually action that. How do we know if we're effective, and how can we find that out? And I think evaluation is one of the ways we can do that. So to start off, well, Thomas already gave a great introduction, but to give a bit more about me, so I've spent sort of 6-7 years working in the international development space with the UN, with international NGOs, think tanks. But now I've transitioned to become an M&E consultant. I did a Master's of Evaluation, so that's my passion area. And I've been working alongside some animal organizations recently, like Faunalytics and Leaping Bunny. So I'm really excited to learn from all of you as well as to how evaluation can benefit your work. And I also want to say, Tom Billington from Fish Welfare Initiative also contributed a lot to this presentation, but couldn't be here today, so big shout out to him. We have a handout today to go along with the presentation. You can find the link in Eventory. I have some hard copies for those of us who like that. Maybe I can give you to pass that around. It also should work on the QR code. It worked for me before, so if there's any difficulties, I am sorry, but hopefully that. But otherwise, the Eventory link as well should work, or we have hards. So just follow along. It's also for you to take home so you can reflect on the talk later. So today, what am I going to talk about? Well, we're going to talk about what is evaluation and do I need one? We're going to talk about planning your evaluation. Why do this and who is it for? What questions are you going to ask and how are you going to decide what good means? How are you going to collect data and analyze data? And how are you going to make it credible and useful for yourself, your stakeholders, the movement as a whole, the public? So it's only 45 minutes, so I'm just going to set out a bit of a in-out scope to start off with. So today we're going to talk a lot about do-it-yourself evaluation. So we're talking about, smaller scale, probably lower stake evaluations. We're not talking about really complex ones like RCTs or process tracing. For those, you would need an expert to help you. We're talking more about designing and planning an evaluation. We're not going to get so much into the weeds of data, different data collection methods and methodologies, but I have got some resources which you can check out to upskill on those. And we're talking more about evaluation principles, and it might not be specific exactly to your context, but I'm hoping it will be transferable. But I am here today, and I'm happy to link up with you over email or Slack or whatever if you have specific questions, so do get in touch. Cool, so let's go on. What is evaluation, and do I need one? So firstly, evaluation. What even is it? So when we talk about evaluation, we're talking about the process of judging if something, that could be a program, project, a policy, is good, valuable, or worthwhile. We're asking the question, are we doing the right thing? Now, often people say, oh, but evaluation and research, they must be quite similar, and they are. There is definitely overlap. But I like to think of evaluation as a bit different in that we really want to get at a judgment of value. So with research, we're often asking questions that are more describing a situation. Does X correlate with Y? What are the similarities and differences between this and that? What is this thing like? But with evaluation, we're asking questions like, so what? So what if your program does this? What does that mean? What do we do with it? Should we continue? Should we scale up? Should we give more funding? That's what we're really trying to get at. And today I've split evaluation into two very broad categories. We've got process evaluation, which is looking at how well we are implementing our project. And we've got outcome or impact evaluation, which is focused on how effective or impactful is your project program. And I'll just say, I'm going to interchange program, project, don't worry about it. They're the same thing, I'm just using different words. So these two are really important because they're telling us two different things about our program. So process evaluation is really important because you might have a really effective idea, but you implement it poorly. So it's not going to yield results. Process evaluation will tell you if you're doing the implementing poorly. You might also have an ineffective idea that you execute really well. So outcome or impact evaluation is going to tell you that, because maybe you implemented great, but it's just not a great idea. So it's really important to have both of these elements. So what about the M in M&E? We always talk about M&E together, and that's because they're very related. So the M in M&E stands for monitoring. And when we talk about monitoring, we're talking about the frequent collection of data that helps us track progress and answer what I like to think of as smaller everyday questions, like how many activities did we run? How many people are we reaching? What types of people are we reaching? How much are we spending? So it's focused on that kind of regular collection of data. And monitoring, by the way, is really important. And I'm sure most of you in the room are already doing it, and it's definitely worth investing in. But monitoring alone often doesn't or can't answer more complex questions, like, are these activities the best ones we could be doing? Or are we reaching the right types of people or enough people? What does that mean? Are we having an impact? Are we cost effective? Often, just by gathering those kind of tracking numbers, we can't get that. So that's why we need evaluation. Okay, shout out to any Shakespeare fans in the room. To E or not to E, that is the question. So should you do an evaluation? Well, I like to think of 3 questions to help us with this. So firstly, are you asking big questions or small questions? And by that I mean big questions like, are we doing the right thing? Smaller questions, are we doing things right? Now the difference with that, are we doing the right things is more an evaluative question. Are we doing things right is more a monitoring question. Are we living up to the plans, the milestones, the goals we set ourselves? So for some of these questions, especially if it's something like, how many people are we reaching? Your monitoring data might just be able to tell you that. You don't need to do a big evaluation to know that. But if you're asking those bigger questions, those substantive questions, like, are we doing the right thing? Is this worth it? It often does require a little bit more digging and an evaluation. So has your program been running long enough to see a valuable change? And now this is very variable because some projects might not see change for years, and others might run a retreat and think they'll see progress in 3 days. So I can't give you a time frame here, but think about what would make sense for your project or program. You know, most of us could say, if I did something, you know, if in this talk I were to evaluate you in 1 minute and say, okay, did you learn enough? You would say, of course not, you've only just started. So then it wouldn't make sense, and I wouldn't do that. I would evaluate you after the talk, or, you know, a longer time period away. So make sure that you're doing it at the right time. Do you have the time and resources to evaluate? And I think it's really important to acknowledge that M&E does take time and resources away from the really important work you're doing. We do have to put a lot of thought into our evaluation, and every minute or dollar you're spending on it doesn't go into your program directly. So it is important to think about, like, do you actually have the human resources, the money, whatever else it might take to do this justice now? Or maybe it's better to wait. Maybe it's better to work on your monitoring system, and that's really okay. So I think these are 3 questions that can really help you decide if an evaluation is right for you at this point. So another question I often get is a very, like, but it's really hard, I just couldn't possibly. And I think I see where that's coming from, because I think we often associate evaluation with these very complex types of evaluation, like a randomized control trial or something. But evaluation is a very broad field. There's lots of different ways you can evaluate. And it doesn't have to be academic or onerous. It can be a do-it-yourself way, but it takes a bit of planning. And I think the most key thing here is that for an evaluation you do, it needs to be credible enough, have credible enough evidence to draw sound judgments. And what I mean by that is, when you do an evaluation, you want it to be useful to any decision you make. So often we are not running such high-stakes programs like a drug that could have terrible side effects that might really hurt people. So we need to know very clearly if that's how that's going to go. And so we need to do big randomized control trials. Most of us are not dealing with something at that high stakes level, right? Maybe our decision is, should we put more money into activity A or activity B? Or do we need to change our outreach strategy to meet different people? For those questions, we might not need to be as sure. So it's okay that we get credible enough evidence for the decision we need to make. So again, we don't need to get perfect evidence, just good enough for what we're trying to do. And I will say, though, for complex questions, especially when you're doing impact or outcome evaluation, and if it's high stakes, if there's lots of money on the line, if your reputation is on the line, if you're trying to prove your attribution or contribution and you need high certainty, I would advise it's helpful to get an evaluation expert to support you there, just because they will have that knowledge. They also will bring a bit of independence to the process, because if you're doing it yourself, there's always that implication that you could be a bit biased. But outside of these situations, I think it's really great to do your own evaluations as well, so that you can learn and prosper with your team. All right, so we're going to assume that we're going on with our evaluation. We've gone through all these steps, and we think it's a good idea. So the first steps we're going to talk about now is, why are you doing this and who is it for? So when we do evaluation, I like to think of there being 3 key reasons. The first is proving what we're doing works, and that aligns with that idea of outcome or impact evaluation. The second is improving, learning, and adjusting what we're doing. So that's often for your own staff, your partners, volunteers, the movement as a whole. We want to know if we can change up what we're doing and adjust it so we can be better. Or it might be accounting for what we promise. So a lot of us are receiving money from donors or from the general public, and they expect us to be delivering certain results with that money. So we often need to account for that and be transparent about what we have achieved with it. And it's important to think about, what is your primary reason? Of course, you often have many reasons when you evaluate, but what's your primary reason? And that's important because, one, it will point you in the direction of who the audience is for your evaluation, which we're going to talk about next. The second is that it will shape what kind of questions you're asking. So if we're proving, we're going to be asking much more of those impact effectiveness questions rather than those process questions. Also, it might change what evidence you're collecting. If we're trying to improve and learn, and it's for our staff, we might be asking lots of qualitative questions. We might have some really interesting reflective discussions, and that's valuable, credible evidence. If we're doing it for our donor and they love numbers, that might not be a good evaluation for them, so we might ask different questions and use different methods. So on that, who is the audience for your evaluation and how will they use it? So we mentioned a few of these before. It could be your staff, and you might want to help them improve and learn. It could be your donor, who wants to think about whether they should increase your funding, continue your funding. They might want to verify what you're doing. It could be participants or the general public you work with, and they might want to know, like, should they keep participating in your program or working with you? Is it worth their time? It could be for the public or the animal community as a whole, and that might be about learning what works or deciding whether to keep providing you with financial support or with non-financial support. So also, these aren't fixed. These are just examples. I mean, staff sometimes are interested in deciding if their participation is worthwhile, or donors are interested in learning. But it's helpful to think about, the why you're doing something, who is it for primarily, and what are they going to do with it, because that really helps you decide how to ask your questions and how to gather your data. And again, an evaluation is no use if it is not used. That's just wasting resources. So if you do an evaluation, and I've seen it in places I've worked, and you do it and you present it and nothing happens, no one takes a decision, no one uses it to continue funding or to continue something, no one uses it to change what they're doing or adjust, they just sort of put it on the shelf, then, what was it for? Those resources could have gone into your program. So make sure that if you're going to do an evaluation, that you have a use in mind and it does get used. Otherwise, maybe it wasn't worth it. All right, so we've decided we need an evaluation. We've thought long and hard about why we're doing it and who it's for, who our target audience is. And now we need to figure out what we're going to evaluate. So we know our project or program, I'm guessing. We have something in mind. But what do we want to know specifically about that? What are we evaluating? So before we evaluate, we need to design some evaluation questions so we can clarify what we are measuring and evaluating. And I'm going to digress here into a random example of bananas. So I'm going to need a little bit of audience participation here from you. If I asked you, what is a good banana? What makes a good banana? What would you say? Now, just shout it out. It's a banana. It's ridiculous anyway, so no answers are wrong.
Taste.
Taste, yep.
Softness.
Softness, yep.
Looks roughly like that.
Okay, yeah. This model banana here. So looks, any others?
Smell.
Smell.
Ripeness.
Ripeness. Love it. Okay, so that's a lot already, right? So what I'm trying to illustrate here is when we're talking about what is good, there's lots of ways we might be able to measure that. Lots of questions we could ask. We could investigate how tasty this banana is, how delightfully smelling this banana is, how ripe it is, how yellow it is, how perfectly rounded it is. So we need to make a decision about what we're talking about. So your program is the banana, and you need to decide what good means for you. So there are two ways we can often get this information. We can use some common evaluation criteria or questions. So for example, the OECD has in international development land the DAC criteria, which are common criteria that you use. I've got the link in the presentation for you to check that out. There's also lots of resources online that will tell you some good evaluation questions or criteria, or your program's theory of change. So, firstly, evaluation questions. I'm going to warn you, this slide is a bit busy, and I've done it that way so that you can refer later, so don't feel you have to read it all. Process evaluation, again, we're focusing on how, like, that implementation phase. So we're asking questions about, are we implementing activities well? Are we on track? Are we reaching the right people, enough people? Are we communicating well with them? Are they satisfied? Are they happy? How efficiently are we doing all of that? We're asking very operational questions. For outcome or impact evaluation, we're asking quite different questions. We're asking about our effectiveness. How effectively did we achieve our goals? How cost effective were we? Is it impactful long term? Who did the program work for? In what circumstances and why? What were the unintended outcomes? Because we shouldn't just focus on what we wanted to achieve. We also have to take into account what happened that we didn't expect. And maybe to what extent can changes be attributed to your program. So these are kind of classic evaluation questions. They're a great base to really help you get to those questions that aren't just, what is our program? What did we do? How much money do we have? Like, we're getting beyond the what is questions and we're getting into a so what question. So these are really great base. But they're not specific to your program. So the next part is your theory of change. Now, we don't have time today to talk a lot about theory of change. I know Tom, my co-conspirator, gave a talk on this last year. So, and I'm sure some of you have already done this. So just to say, we won't be talking about it. And if this is leaving you a bit confused, there's some links in the resources where you can learn more about this. But basically, a theory of change is this sort of idea you have of how your program functions, how you get from the activities you're doing through to sort of intermediate outcomes all the way to the eventual impact you want to have. So I've got an example here for a university vegan program to try and get more students to become vegan. So maybe we hold vegan information sessions at university and students attend them, and students then understand veganism, and then they adopt veganism, and then we reduce animal suffering. This is very basic. I will say, it's just an example. There's lots of assumptions and risks in here. And of course, if you had a theory of change actually about this project, it would probably look a lot more messy. But it's great just to demonstrate to you how this will work. So now we're going to use this theory of change to help us identify maybe some more evaluation questions. All right, here's our theory of change again. So when we are looking at our theory of change, what we really want to focus on is the arrows connecting. So hold vegan information sessions at university, and then we're assuming students attend. But do they attend? And if not, why not? You know, do they know, is it in a good place for them? Is it well publicized? Okay, then we're assuming students attend and then they just understand veganism. Okay, but did we tell them it in a good way? Did we make it accessible? Did we make it culturally appropriate? Okay, then we say, oh, they'll understand and they'll just become vegan. Okay, but there might be lots of other reasons that could impede their veganism. Maybe their family doesn't agree, or the university doesn't offer those options, or they don't have enough money to buy vegan food. So we're making lots of assumptions here, and those assumptions can be great places to get evaluation questions. So I've got a few here. Oh, and this is showing you where process evaluation happens and outcome and impact evaluation happens. And here are some additional questions. So here we might be asking about how well we're working with vegan groups. Partnerships is really important often, so we want to get a sense of how well we're doing that. We maybe want to know how supportive the educational and familiar environment is for students, so we can understand if there's barriers. And maybe we want to know how sustainable is that dietary change, because we're not going to see reduced animal suffering if people only go vegan for like a week. We ideally want them to stay vegan. So that's an example of how you could use your theory of change to get more questions that might be more relevant to your program and to the decisions you're making. So that's a lot of questions. But we need to prioritize, and prioritize again, because we can't ask all the questions we want to know, right? I mean, there are so many things you could ask. And I would invite you to always think about what is most useful to help you make decisions. So in our previous example, maybe I could have said, oh, I would really love to know like if students' religion interacts with if they go vegan. And that might be a really interesting question, right? But is it going to help you? Are you going to change your program to meet, I don't know, to reach out to Muslim students or to Orthodox Christian students? Or do you just want to know because you want to know? And if you just want to know because you want to know, then let's deprioritize that, because we really need to focus on what we can action. So another way you can prioritize is by working and reflecting with others. So evaluation can be very lonely if you do it alone, so it's great to get your team involved. One way I've seen this done is people posting up questions, and then you give people 3 votes, like 3 sticky dots, and people can stick the dots on their priority questions. And that way you can kind of get a list of, say, 5 that the majority of your team think are important. And I think 5 is a good number, because beyond that, we're creating a very complex evaluation. And honestly, the more questions you have and the more data you're presenting to your stakeholders, sometimes the more they're going to switch off and they don't really know what to take from it, because you're just kind of giving them a lot. So I think it's great to prioritize as much as you can to get that list down. The next part is we've asked these evaluation questions. Now we have to decide, what does good even mean? So we need some standards to judge how good our program is. We're going to come back to our favorite example, the banana. So we talked about that a banana could be, we could ask questions about how good a banana is. We might ask how tasty it is, how ripe it is, how delightfully smelling it is, how beautifully formed it is. But then we have to decide, okay, how tasty is a banana? Well, how do we demarcate that? Where does good tasting banana end and average tasting banana begin? So maybe it's about the percentage of sugar. Maybe appearance is about how many black dots the banana has, or like the percentage surface area that is black versus yellow. So this is silly, but what I'm trying to get at is, how do you demarcate the levels between good, average, and bad, or however many performance levels you want? Because we need to be clear about that. Often what I see in evaluations is people ask the questions, do the research, present the data, and like, job done. But it's not done, because we need to make a value judgment about whether this is good, worth doing, worthwhile, worth our money. So we need to actually say if it's good or not, which takes a bit of bravery. So it's good to demarcate those levels. So how do we do it? So you can use benchmarks. I used to work in water sanitation hygiene, and that's an awesome location to, sector to work in, because we have very clear benchmarks about what is good quality water. We know it has certain chlorine levels, has to have certain minuscule levels of bacteria, it has to have this, that, the other. Very easy benchmarks. You could benchmark against other organizations. So, I mean, maybe you know other organizations that have done a vegan university program, and they have data that they can share with you. You can benchmark yourself on that. Maybe you talk to experts and you ask them about dietary change, like what would they say is good for getting people to adopt veganism. Maybe there's literature on dietary change. It might not be specific to veganism, but it might tell you, generally, when we do a diet program, 20% of people change their diet. Awesome, maybe that's a starting benchmark. Maybe we don't have any information and we're gonna have to go into the dark together. And then you can discuss together in your team and create some kind of grading framework. I mean, you might remember this from when you were in high school and you're doing essays and your teacher had kind of clear marking criteria. We're basically doing that, but for our project. And I'm going to show you an example in a moment. But an important thing is to try do this before you analyze your data. Because what often happens is we get our data and then we try to decide what is good based on those numbers, not based on what we actually think. And it means we can sometimes be a bit biased because we like our programs to be good. So we move the goalposts of what good means to fit the data, not put the data on what we already decided. I mean, there's nuances there, right? Sometimes we set the goalposts and we don't properly understand the context, or the context changes a lot. That happens in advocacy, right? Like you set the goalposts and then suddenly there's this big other thing that happens, or campaign, or a person, celebrity goes vegan, and whoa, our goalposts are blown out of the water. So I'm not saying it's a hard and fast rule, but it's good practice to try to do it before you evaluate. So, how effective were we at getting students to adopt veganism? This is just a really rough example of how you might set up these kind of evaluation standards. So we might say, well, and again, I've made these up, so don't take these as gospel truth. This is like just for example purposes. So we might say great is if 10% of students who come report being vegan after 6 months, and 80% of students who came report reductions in animal product consumption. Maybe we don't have to be specific about reductions, just any reduction from their baseline. We could be more specific if we wanted to be, up to our project. Maybe we say adequate is like 5%, up to 10% of students are vegan after 6 months, and then or 50% plus of students report reductions in animal product consumption. So we're saying great is quite a high bar here. Probably we're going to come into adequate because we have to meet 2 quite hard conditions. You don't have to make yours this hard, but it's just an example. And then finally, needs improvement. We're setting the levels again. So if either of those things are true, we're going to put ourselves in needs improvement. So this is just one example of how you can come up with some kind of framework to help you decide if your project is good, average, or bad. Okay, so we've decided if we're going to do an evaluation. We know who, we know the why, we know the what now, and we know what good means. So now the how. How are we going to answer our evaluation questions and get that data? So for each evaluation question, we need to think about what data or information would answer your question and how you might get it. So how effective were we at getting students to adopt veganism? Now I will say, if you've done like a project proposal and you put indicators in that proposal, this is like your indicators, but it's just another way of thinking about it without using too much jargon. So if we're answering this question, how effective were we at getting students to adopt veganism, we might decide, okay, we want some kind of self-reported data about people's dietary state. How long have they been that way? How strict are they, maybe? Something like this. Maybe we want some idea of like how integrated it is into their lifestyle. And we might get this information through some surveys, some interviews. Maybe we're going to look at some secondary data for that evidence of lifestyle integration. There's many ways we could get this information. So how are we going to decide how to do it? And that's the next point. So when we do data collection, we have a few different strategies available to us. These are kind of the 4 broad methods, I would say. They all kind of fit into bigger, more complicated methodologies, but we're just going to focus on the methods for now. So one way you could do it is to collect survey data. So I'm sure we all know surveys, we've all done them. They could be pre-post, they could be satisfaction surveys. We often analyze them using descriptive or inferential statistics. Surveys are great because they're often quite cheap. They give you a broad answer to know if something is happening. But the downfall with surveys is response rates can be really hard to get, especially if you are asking people to do it for free. And when you get a really low response rate, it might not give you as good data as you want. It can be annoying. People get like, stop surveying me, I've done it so many times. And it also won't give you in-depth data about why people are changing. It's just telling you if it's happening. You can add in like those questions, but often in surveys, people don't write very detailed answers. They just want to kind of keep going. And it's also a bit biased because people are filling out the survey and they often have a bit of a desirability bias. They want to appear good for you. So that's also a factor. Another way we can do this is we can go talk to people, so we can do interviews, focus group discussions, group reflection sessions with your own staff, volunteers, partners. That's also really valuable. And we often will do this by analysing them through like thematic or pattern analysis to see the commonalities of what people are saying and certain types of people are saying. So interviews are really, these kind of talking to people methods are really great if you have small groups or hard to reach participants because they're much more focused. They also can give you much deeper information about why changes are happening. You can probe people, you can ask them to tell you and connect the dots, and that can be really interesting, especially if you do this for people of contrasting like demographics, or people who have really engaged with your program and people who didn't engage at all. That's a really interesting difference to explore. And reflective sessions are also really valuable, especially in advocacy. If you've done a big campaign and you want to know how it went, we can do that kind of reflection together, and that's a really great method to generate data. The other two are more external. So observation is where we can observe people. So in our example, maybe we observe them in the supermarket, or we observe their purchasing in the cafeteria or something. We could do that, and that could be an interesting way to generate some quantitative data. We could also do it qualitatively, like you can explore how people are interacting in the cafeteria. So maybe we just are watching to see, are people considering the vegan option? Are they buying this and that? It's really great, but it can take up a lot of resources because you have to do it. You have to go and observe. And the final one is secondary data. So we have so much data today, right? Like everyone is collecting data on all of us, and social media analytics, admin data or administrative data, there's a lot around. So get creative. Like, can you get purchasing data from the cafeteria? That would be cool. Can we get social media data? Can we analyze that to see if people are talking about veganism more? Think about if there's any secondary data you can use that can bolster your case, because it's often quite cheap to get and analyze, and it adds another dimension to these more people-focused ones. So when you're deciding between these methods, we've already talked about some of the pros and cons, but think about what do you already have. So if you're already doing a survey, hey, let's not do another survey, let's go interview people. We could use that survey to figure out who to interview. That could be really cool, because then we can see that contrast between people who are high engagement, low engagement maybe, or other like extremes. Are you asking broad questions? Is it happening? Or are you asking deep questions, why is it happening? So if you want to know, is it happening? Maybe a survey is great. If you want to know why someone's becoming vegan, let's go talk to them, because I think that will give us better data. What's feasible within your resources? So, I mean, surveys are super cheap. That's why we often do them. Maybe interviews are more expensive. But think about, you can always reduce the sample size, right, within certain limitations. So think about what you can actually do. Can you actually go there? Can you actually go interview people? Or are they all spread across the world? Maybe it's hard. Maybe you use Zoom. But think about what's feasible. And what type of evidence is credible? So again, this is coming back to our audience. Do they expect numbers, like quantitative data? Or do they like stories? Do they want to hear about that experience someone's had, why they made a change? Is that inspiring to them? That might help you decide what type of data to collect. Okay, last section, making my evaluation credible and useful. So how can my evaluation be trusted? Of course, there's always limitations to everything we do, and we can't guard against all of them, but here are some ideas of how you can make it a bit more credible and trustworthy. So firstly, reduce selection bias. Don't cherry pick your data. We want to avoid people saying we did that. So you could randomize, that's one idea. You could also pick contrasting cases. So let's just not talk to the people who thought we were awesome. Let's go also talk to people who dropped out of our program. So it doesn't have to be random, it can be purposeful, but let's try not cherry pick who we talk to or what data we collect to make ourselves look good. We can triangulate data, so that means we're getting data from different people, we're getting data from different sources, maybe different methods, so we can say like, oh, people in the survey said this, and actually also people in the interview said this. And when we get that like triangulation point, we feel a bit more confident in the finding. And often you will get disagreement, and that's really interesting too. Why did people in our interviews disagree with the survey? What's happening there? That's really interesting to explore, and so don't shy away from divergence. That's really interesting. Use experts. So let's interview some experts. Let's see what they think. Let's give them a sense check. Let's sense check our data with the people we were working with our stakeholders. Maybe we haven't quite captured what the reality of the situation is. Because experts doesn't just mean academics, right? It's people with lived experience, people who know this inside out. Maybe they have cultural expertise. Maybe it's academic. Maybe it's something else. Compare your data. So another great way, think about who your treatment group and compare with someone who you didn't work with. So maybe you worked in one university and not in the sister university, and we can compare to them. Or maybe we worked with a year group and not another. We could compare and see if we're seeing similar vegan uptake or not, and that might tell us a bit about if our program's working. But it doesn't have to just be that. We can compare, as I was saying, different cases. Why did this person take up veganism so rigorously and this person just not at all respond to what we did? That's a really interesting contrast. Let's figure out why that might have been. That might help us learn. And build a reasoned case. So another thing is to remember, like, you're a lawyer. Let's build the logical case for why we think we helped these people become vegan. So we know, so let's say, they came to our activities. We know that they actually changed their mind about veganism. And then we know they actually are buying vegan things. You know, maybe we got the receipts from their purchases. That could be another source of secondary data. So we know all these things, and together that creates a really strong chain of evidence. And then we just need to say, okay, but what's the alibi? What's not in our favor? Okay, so maybe their best friend also went vegan. Oh, that might diminish our impact a little. So don't be afraid to talk about that. That's really important, because you're acknowledging that you might not have done the whole thing, but you definitely contributed in some way. So always recognize your limitations. It won't be perfect. And finally, again, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. And I love this picture because depending on what they're doing, both of these guys could be right or wrong. If we're sailing across the Atlantic, I mean, maybe not the Titanic, but we might want to design a really great boat because it's high stakes. We need high certainty we're going to get there. If we're just going to a channel island, like 200 meters offshore, let's just start building the boat. Like, we don't need all this hardcore planning. We just need a rough idea and some hammers and some nails. So this is what I like to think of as DIY evaluation. So understand, are you this one? Are you going across the Atlantic, or are you just going to an island? Because if you know almost nothing, almost anything will tell you something. And that's what I want you to take away from this talk today. I want to empower you to do evaluation, to feel like you have the tools, to do it intentionally, to plan it out, but not to be scared that it will have limitations. It won't be perfect, but that's okay. We just need credible enough evidence to make good enough judgments. This is a wrap-up of what we talked about today, but I'm just going to skim through. Here are some resources you can have a look at later. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sophie, and you're good at speaking fast. So we do have time for a few questions. So the first question is, have you ever made a mistake that gave you the wrong results, or how did you find out? Do you check for mistakes, and if so, how do you check?
Yeah, I think with wrong results, I mean, I don't know if I've ever gotten a really wrong result, but I think it is always important to sense check. I remember I did an evaluation with an organization that worked in India, and I thought we had a really cool finding that, like, oh, all the health workers seem to be we got volunteers to become like health ambassadors, and then I was like, oh, all these health ambassadors seem to have relatives that are also working as midwives. Wow, maybe that means it's not just good people, it's just like people who are already connected to the health system. And then one of my colleagues was like, oh no, but in India we just call everyone auntie and sister and brother, so maybe this is nothing. And that was a really good learning for me, that, like, again, I was coming at it from a very different cultural context and thought I had found this awesome finding that could have implications for how we were choosing our health ambassadors, but actually it was just a cultural misunderstanding, and we might just have to change the instrument to understand that better.
Right. And that can apply to many contexts.
Of course.
If you're a non-vegan studying vegans, you might just you don't know the culture, and then make some mistakes.
To be vegan, right? Yeah, for sure.
Right. So the next question is, how do you set benchmarks and standards when you are just collecting qualitative data?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and you're right, I did give very quantitative example. But when you're doing qualitative, often you can talk about levels. Again, it's a little bit subjective, but qualitative data always is a bit subjective. That's sort of its inherent nature. But you can talk about, like, it demonstrates a strong understanding of veganism, and maybe you could have examples of what that could look like. You might say, like, high level of engagement, high levels of enthusiasm. So we often have, like, some sort of subjective levels of, like, high, medium, low, and we try and describe as much as possible what that level looks like to give that differentiation. So it might not be in percentages, and it might be a little bit subjective, like high or most or something like this, but you can sort of get a flavor for it when you talk to people. people. I would also say it's great to check with other people. So if you're doing qualitative analysis of interviews and you come away and you think, oh, that person, they were really enthusiastic, like high enthusiasm, I put them in this box. Go check with your colleague and see if they get the same sense from the data. I mean, look, today you can even check with ChatGPT. I mean, like, the technology is crazy. But that's a really good way to see if you're getting the same instinct that others are getting from the data, and if that's really the right categorization. And I mean, this is what like teachers do, right? Like when you write an essay, often we can't put it all in numbers. We have to say, like, was it a strong argument? Was it a middling argument? Was it a weak argument? So like education frameworks and how they talk about this stuff is a really good way to like think about how you could talk about it too.
And the next question from Ola is, have you ever had interesting insights from interviewing people? Was there any unobvious ones?
Yeah. I find interviewing people really fascinating. I'll come back again to this example. Well, actually, I've had a couple of examples. One example, when I did a project in Papua New Guinea, we were doing a whole project on women's rights and helping women have more agency in their relationships. And we did this whole workshop series where we taught couples about how to be respectful and all these things, and we hoped that that would make their marriage less violent and more so better for the women's well-being. But what we found when we interviewed some of the women that didn't come through in our other results was that some women were taking that idea of respect and saying, oh, well, now my husband and I don't fight because I just respect everything he says and I just do it. And we were like, oh, that was not what we meant by that. And that was really interesting because that hadn't come through anywhere else, but it was coming through, and it only came through in 3 stories, right? And sometimes with qualitative data, people will say things like, well, only 3 out of 20 people said it, so it's not important. But when we do qualitative, we're not thinking about percentages, right? We're one person who, has a terrible assault, that is really important. We need to action that. 3 people who come away from our program with the absolute opposite idea of what they're meant to is a big problem, and we need to action that, even if it's only 3. So that was a really good example, I thought, of like how interviewing can really shed different light on something.
That's a really good point. And for the qualitative part, do you recommend any specific tools for qualitative data analysis? For example, high amounts of interview materials? Yeah,
okay. So for qualitative analysis, high amounts of interview materials, do they mean like a lot of interviewing, I'm guessing? I'll go with it. So I think when we do qualitative work, we're aiming for saturation. So often with quantitative, we have like a set sample size, but for qualitative, we often don't do that. The sample size is we keep talking to people until we don't learn anything new. So once you've talked to someone and you're like, I already knew that, I already knew that too, I already knew that, and it's getting a little bit repetitive, that's like the sign that you've kind of hit the wall. Sometimes, of course, we can't get there because that could take hundreds of people and we don't have resources, so we have to cap it early. But that's often what they talk about in qualitative, that we're trying to get to saturation. When it comes to analyzing qualitative data, you can do this really easily yourself. Like the old school way was to kind of like open up an Excel and put in some kind of key themes and kind of put in the quotes that matched with the theme. Nowadays with ChatGPT, there's some great extensions where ChatGPT can do a lot of that sort of sorting for you and pull out key themes. But I would say to be careful with that. Like, it's awesome, it can save you time, but you need to still engage with the data and read through some of the interview transcripts to make sure that ChatGPT isn't misunderstanding the cultural context or some of the nuances, because when people are talking, we talk in sarcasm, we can be really euphemistic. I heard the other day that doctors in the US, because of the restrictions in some states, talk about going on holiday to Colorado for getting an abortion. If ChatGPT saw that, it might just tell you, oh, doctors really love Colorado for holidays. Well, that's not what they meant. And as humans, we understand that subtext, but sometimes the computers don't. So it's really good to read it through yourself and do that double check. But yeah, I guess the 2 points from that is like, try get to saturation if you can, and use these new tools if you want to, but double check them, and otherwise DIY it yourself. An easy Excel spreadsheet's all you really need.
All right, thank you so much. That's all we had time for. Please give another round of applause.
Thank you.